Hello, everyone. The South Carolina Office of Special Education Services, along with the Transition Alliance of South Carolina, present Using Evidence-Based Practices to Teach Reading. This presentation is part of the Summer Transition Camp webinar series. The information and resources contained in this webinar are for general information purposes only and should not be construed as an endorsement by the South Carolina Department of Education.
Our presenter today is Dr. Kristen Beach. She is a former middle school teacher from the Los Angeles Unified School District and is now a current associate professor of special education at UNC Charlotte. Her research focuses on the development and evaluation of reading interventions for adolescents with learning disabilities and students reading several levels below grade level. Dr. Beach's work is interdisciplinary and recently focused on academic vocabulary instruction and supporting reading comprehension within the disciplines. She teaches courses on assessment, writing, adolescent reading at the undergraduate level, and a doctoral level course, special education research design. Dr. Beach will present today on using evidence-based practices to teach reading.
Great, thank you for having me. I'm really thrilled to be able to be here and present some information on using evidence-based practices to teach reading. So thanks again for having me. The purpose of today's presentation is what I really want to do is provide an overview of evidence-based approaches for improving the reading performance of students specifically who are in middle and secondary school. And my goal is to provide this overview, but then also to provide some example applications of the strategies in text so that everyone viewing the presentation can see what it might look like in the classroom. So I'm going to focus on 3 evidence-based practices today, and all of these I derived from IES's evidence-based practice guide for teaching adolescent readers to read. And these 3 practices, each of them have strong evidence for improving reading outcomes for adolescent readers. So the first is to provide explicit vocabulary instruction. The second is to provide direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction. And the third is to provide intensive intervention. And I'm going to focus specifically on word level interventions today. While you're doing the presentation, I encourage you to go ahead and fill out the guided notes, and I'm just going to review what that might look like for you. Our 3 focus strategies are on top, so vocabulary, comprehension, and word reading strategies are our column headers. And then for each, I encourage you to write down key ideas. So as you're viewing the presentation, what are some key ideas or some main points that you're drawing out of the information that I'm presenting? One question that you have or something that maybe you're wondering about, and it can be a clarifying question or maybe an application question. How might I use this in this particular situation? So you might write your questions down here. And these would be good questions to ask later at the Meet the Presenter sessions. And then the last thing that you might write down is how you might use the strategy in the classroom. How might you incorporate this practice into your own teaching in the classroom? So we'll revisit the guided notes as we go through the presentation. So let's start with our first evidence-based practice with strong evidence for impacting reading outcomes for adolescent readers, and that's providing explicit vocabulary instruction. This is also my favorite practice to do because it's a lot of fun. So explicit vocabulary instruction is an approach to directly teaching the meaning of words, not having students look it up in the dictionary, not having students intuit or try and use context clues to figure out the meaning, but explicitly and directly teaching those words. And the reason why we do this is because knowing the meaning of words is really important and critical for comprehending text. So it's clear that getting the words off the page, decoding is important, right? But if you can read all the words on the page, but you're not sure what they mean, or you're not sure what even a small proportion of them mean, then it's going to be very difficult to understand the text that you're reading. So having a wide range of vocabulary knowledge is really important for reading comprehension, our ultimate goal. Also, as many as 73% of adolescents who have comprehension difficulties have low levels of vocabulary knowledge. So that's pretty huge. If you have kids in your classroom who have difficulty understanding text, the large majority of them have low levels of vocabulary. One of the reasons why they have difficulty understanding text is because they're not quite sure about the meanings of the words in the text. Fortunately, teaching these words directly is going to improve their knowledge of the word. So if we provide direct instruction on important vocabulary words, we can improve students' vocabulary knowledge. So you can focus on lots of different kinds of words when you're teaching vocabulary. Today, I'm going to talk about teaching academic vocabulary, and I'm going to provide some general guidelines for instruction in academic vocabulary. Content area teachers, or if your students are reading content area or disciplinary texts, are also going to need to focus on content area vocabulary. And how you teach academic vocabulary and content area vocabulary is usually going to look pretty different. So again, today I'm just going to focus on academic vocabulary instruction. And so academic vocabulary instruction is also known as general academic vocabulary. These words are interdisciplinary. They're found in texts across discipline. They're in math, they're in history, they're in science, they're in your English books, they're in art, they're in music, they're across disciplines. They usually occur in texts with high frequency. So they're not unique words. They're not words that you only see once every couple of books or something like that. They're also considered high utility words. So these are words that if you know the meaning of the words, your understanding of the text is really going to be improved because these words carry a lot of meaning of the text. So some examples are approach, evidence, major, require, and specific. So again, these words are interdisciplinary. They occur in texts with high frequency. And if you know the meanings of the words, it's going to help you understand the text. And if you don't know the meanings of the words, you're going to have some trouble understanding the text. Some non-examples are window and happy. So these are pretty common everyday words. They occur in high frequency across text and probably in some ways maybe interdisciplinary, but they're not really high utility, right? Well, I mean, I suppose they could be high utility, but it's likely that most students know the meanings of these words. Some other non-examples are isotope, which you might only find in science, and Mediterranean Sea, which you might only find in geography or history. So these bottom words are words that we wouldn't use academic vocabulary instruction approaches to teach. You might use a content area approach or disciplinary vocabulary approach to teach something like isotope and Mediterranean Sea, but not the approach that I'm going to show you today. So when you're thinking about what academic vocabulary words you want to teach, there's a couple different ways you can go about this. One strategy is to teach sets of words in like a vocabulary program that you design or perhaps you adopt from a curriculum. And a lot of times the words that are contained in word lists, so vocabulary word lists that you might teach, come from some published source. And one source of academic word lists is Coxhead's academic word list. And you can, this is hyperlinked if you have access to the slides, but you can also just Google Coxhead's academic word list. And what it is it's a list of hundreds of words that are academic vocabulary words that are important for kids to know. You can also derive words from assigned texts. So students have texts that they're reading in your class. So it's either the textbook or it's ratings from online or some primary sources in history. And there's academic vocabulary words in those texts that your kids might not know, but they really need to know. So that might be where you're deriving your words for teaching from. And you also need to select words carefully. So you want to select words that occur frequently in the text. So if you are not using like a word list to select your words, and if you're using like a text that your kids are going to read tomorrow in class, looking at the text, you need to select words that occur often in the text and or possibly select words that are really critical to know for understanding the text. It should go out without saying, of course, that you're selecting words to teach that you think your kids don't know. So you're not going to take the time to teach words, of course, that you think that most of your kids probably know, or to teach words that are really easily explained in just a sentence or two or demonstrated. So you want to reserve this extended vocabulary instruction for words that have more nuanced meaning to them, that are a little bit harder to understand, that students need more exposure to understand, and that occur frequently in the text and that are also critical for understanding the text. So there's some recommendations on how many words you need to teach your students in order to help improve their comprehension and help keep them on track for the words, the number of words that they need to know to be able to comprehend text. And here's some general recommendations. So Beck and colleagues suggest that you could teach about 8 to 10 words per week. Most of their work is in the general education environment. So if you have students who are near grade level, just a little bit below grade level, or students in general education, teaching directly 8 to 10 words per week is a good guideline. If you have students who are significantly reading below grade level, students with learning disabilities in reading, students who have really low levels of oral vocabulary, you might go with 4 to 5 words per week instead. So what we found in our research is that when we try and teach more than about 4 to 5 words per week, the students with very low levels of oral vocabulary have a difficulty retaining understanding of more than that number of words. And so we landed about 4 to 5 words per week for that group of students. And then the length of instruction can really vary depending on how many words you teach per week, or how many students are in your class, or how much time you have in your schedule to teach academic vocabulary directly. But around 15 as a minimum to maybe 40 minutes daily instruction is recommended. If you're teaching words that are aligned to a specific text, so let's say that you're not doing like a daily academic vocabulary like segment of your class, that you're just trying to teach before reading a text a couple of words, the recommendation is to teach the 3 to 5 most important words in the selection, depending on the length of the selection. If it's a shorter selection, you're going to choose fewer words. If it's a really long selection, or if there's a lot of important vocabulary in there, you might teach more words. And you might spend about 5 minutes developing vocabulary knowledge to support comprehension of a specific text. In this instance, though, if you're reading a text and the goal is to comprehend the text or answer questions with the text or write an essay about the text, so the goal is to do something comprehension-wise with the text, and your vocabulary instruction is really to support students' comprehension of that particular text, you can spend a little bit less time on vocabulary because you're really developing vocabulary knowledge for the purpose of understanding that text. That's a little bit different from this recommendation of 15 to 40 minutes daily, when your goal in this kind of instruction is to really develop students' depth and long-term maintenance of vocabulary knowledge of those words. So there's a couple of different ways that you can go about this instruction. So here's the recommended steps for teaching academic vocabulary. So first, you got to select those words for instruction using those parameters that I outlined. Second, you want to design and deliver your instruction. And there's several components to strong academic vocabulary instruction. You might not have time or space in your curriculum to do all of these components, or it might not make sense for you to do all of these components. But the recommendation is that the more components you are able to embed in your instruction, the better outcomes are going to be for your students. So the deeper they'll know the words, and the longer they'll remember the meanings of the words, and the more likely they'll be able to actually access those meanings when they go to comprehend the text. So here's the components. You want to design and provide to students a student-friendly definition. You want to embed the words in a student-friendly context to help students understand how the word works when it's within the context of a sentence or a paragraph. You want to engage students in opportunities to play with the words. And so this part is really important for academic vocabulary, giving students opportunities to play with word meanings. And the goal here really is to help students tease out the nuances of word meaning. And you'll see a little bit of an example of this in a minute. You also want to provide opportunities for students to engage in writing about the words, and then also opportunities for them to apply the meaning within the instructional context. And so, especially if you're teaching word meanings of a text that you're about to read, you might pre-teach those words before you read the text. And then once you get to the words in the text, you definitely want to pause and talk about what the students just learned about what that word means and how that meaning applies in this particular instructional context. While you're doing this, keep in mind that it can take up to 17 or more encounters with a word. So hearing the word, saying the word, thinking about the word's meaning for a student to learn it well. So that's more than just here's a word, here's the definition, let's move on. The students, in order for them to really learn it deeply, need to take up to about 17 encounters with a word. So that suggests that your instruction is a bit extended. It's not super brief, and it's not just a one-day thing. So let's talk a little bit more about student-friendly definitions and explanations. So when you're designing these, you want to use simple everyday language to explain the word meaning. It's really important to make sure that the words that you're using to describe the target word, the vocabulary word that you're teaching, are not as or more difficult than that target word. And that's why we actually design the student-friendly definitions instead of having students go to the dictionary, because when you have them go to the dictionary, a lot of times those dictionary definitions, the definition of the word is as difficult or more difficult sometimes. There's words in there that are more difficult than the word itself. So you really want to design definitions that are easy for your students to understand. The best ones are going to be short and clear. They're not going to have multiple sentences to them, so short and clear definitions. And to the best extent that you can, contextualize the definitions using explanatory phrases. So if you're going to describe a word, you might say something that is dubious is, if your target word is dubious, or someone who acts dubiously, and then you explain what they would do using the definition of the word dubious. Or you might, for another kind of word, you might use this kind of explanatory phrase. So when you blank something, you, so when you analyze something, you, so you kind of contextualize the explanation in this explanatory phrase. And what I always do, regardless of the word and regardless of how much I think I know what the word means, which if I'm teaching middle and high school students words, I'm pretty sure I know what most of them mean already. Even still, I always use the Collins Dictionary online to look up the definition. And the reason is because when I do that, it helps me keep the words that I'm using to explain the target word simple and clear and accurate, short. And then also the Collins Dictionary already uses these explanatory phrases. They already embed these explanatory phrases in their definitions. So it makes that part really easy. So as far as student-friendly context goes, there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. If you have limited time, which I'm just going to assume you do, you might do this quickly using something like an example, non-example of a word. So you'll see what this looks like in a second. And my recommendation is just to include visuals as much as possible. If you have more time, you might design or use a more nuanced instructional context around the word. So you might design a paragraph that uses the word in it, and the context of the paragraph helps kind of illustrate the meaning of the word. But we're going to assume today that y'all have limited time, and so we'll go with the examples and non-examples of the word. So you'll see what that looks like here in a minute. And the last piece that I'm going to go over before you see some examples is the wordplay. And so remember, the point of this is to really help students understand the nuances of word meaning, because the words that you select for academic vocabulary instruction are not ones that are super straightforward. They're ones that can take on shades of meaning in different contexts. So you want to illustrate those through wordplay. You also demonstrate how the word meanings apply across those different contexts. You support development of oral language. So something that's really important to know about this type of instruction, and especially this part, the wordplay part, is that the interaction with students, with each other, and with you as the teacher are oral. And so we're not doing worksheets with the kids. They're not writing. Right, they are doing some writing during instruction, like writing the word down, writing the definition down. Those are good things to do. But their interaction with each other and with you is mostly oral. And so that's going to bring into the conversation kids who have difficulty with writing. It's going to kind of eliminate that writing barrier. And it's also going to lift up the students who have really good like conversational skills, who have a lot of difficulty reading and writing, which sometimes happens with our kids who are reading below grade level. They're really great with conversation and with talking about things and even debating. But they have difficulty with reading and writing. And so we're going to capitalize on those strengths for the students. Also, this wordplay is a great way to support those multiple encounters with the word meaning. And so by engaging in wordplay, you can get students to engage with the meaning of the word multiple times. All right, so there's lots of different ways that you can go about wordplay. You can ask students questions about words, have students make associations between words, make decisions about situations that involve words, use examples and non-examples, so come up with their own examples and non-examples. There's other activities. There's one called conversation snippets, where they overhear a piece of a conversation that has something to do with a word, and they try and guess what word that conversation snippet is related to. And many, many more. And one of the resources that I just love for teaching academic vocabulary that really explains all of these activities is Robust Vocabulary Instruction by Beck, McCowan, and Kukin. And so I've got those books, pictures of them, so you can see them in a little bit. But I really, if academic vocabulary is something that you're very invested in teaching and you want to do really well, I recommend getting those books and looking up all the really engaging and fun activities you can do with your students. All right, so here's some examples of what the instruction might look like. And this is a really condensed version of instruction, so something that you can do relatively quickly. And so our word here is indestructible. So I might tell students, all right, so in this text, you're gonna read this word, indestructible. What word? And have the students repeat it back to you. If something is indestructible, you can't hurt it, break it, or destroy it. So here, this is my student student-friendly definition. So stepping aside, talking to you back as teachers, my student-friendly definition. You could also draw out the fact that in this word, there's, you can use morphemic clues to understand the meaning of this word. So you could draw that out as well. But focusing on the morphemes really isn't the point of academic vocabulary instruction, but it is a good idea to do, especially with middle and secondary students who really need to understand how morphemes operate in words. And so you might say, you'll notice that this word indestructible has a prefix in, that means not. You'll notice it has a suffix able, that means able to. And so if something is indestructible, you're not able to destroy it. So an example is this: Apple Incorporated claims that their Gorilla Glass is indestructible. There's no way you can scratch or break it. Doesn't matter what you do, it's totally indestructible. A non-example is flowers. Flowers are not indestructible. In fact, they are destructible because you can really easily break flowers. You can throw them on the floor and smush them, as you see in the picture to the right. You can just break off, the tops. Like, they're very easy to destroy. They're very delicate and fragile. So for the wordplay part, you might ask, again, you can do this lots of different ways, but here's some examples of questions. And again, the purpose of these questions is really to draw out nuances of the word meaning and also engage your students in conversation around the word. And so one example is you can ask your students to look around the room. What in this room, if anything, is indestructible? And so you have your students share with a peer, you have them raise their hand and share with you. And the point here is that there's really not a right or wrong answer. The point of these questions is to get students talking about words. And if you have a student who loves to kind of play the opposite side in the classroom, whatever someone says, they take like the opposite stance, these activities are perfect for them, because if somebody says, oh, the metal desk over there is indestructible, this is a student who'll say, no, it's not indestructible. I can destroy that desk in 2 seconds by doing X, Y, Z. So the wordplay is a really great oral activity to get students really engaged in thinking about the meaning of the word and applying it to lots of different contexts. You might also introduce another facet of the word. Can a person be indestructible? So the first question is about objects, really. That's probably what students are thinking of when they're thinking of indestructible, but you can deepen students' understanding of the word and how the word might apply by applying it to a person. Can a person be indestructible? What would that look like? Can you be emotionally indestructible, psychologically indestructible, physically indestructible? And so you can generate student conversation around that, really always focusing on a couple of things, having the students use the word indestructible in their responses, and then also in their responses, explain what they're thinking. So explain why they're saying what they're saying. Let's look at another example. This one is for significant. So our word is significant. What word? You have them repeat it back. If something is significant, it is big enough to be important or to impact a situation in a big way. Something that is significant, it's a big deal. So for example, if you witness a car crash, that might be, especially if it's a major car crash, that might be a significant event in your life. It might shape your driving behaviors for the future to come. You might be a more careful driver because you saw like this horrible car crash. It's super significant to you. A non-example is seeing a person walking their dog while you're driving. That happens every day. That's pretty insignificant. It's not significant. You're probably going to pretty quickly forget that. It's not going to really matter to you. So let's do some wordplay around this word significant. So I'm going to say give you a couple of scenarios. And if it's significant to you, you're going to say significant. And if it's insignificant to you, so it doesn't matter, you're going to say insignificant. And then you're going to discuss with the partner. So here's the first one: finding a $100 bill on the sidewalk. So the students would say significant or insignificant, and then they would discuss with the partner or discuss whole class. Failing your English class, getting 500 views on TikTok. Well, what about 5,000, 50,000, 5 million? And so here, with a question like this, we're deepening understanding that something that is significant to one person might not be significant to another person, depending on the person's experiences, the context of the situation. So we're drawing out some nuance and meaning here. What about meeting your favorite singer or celebrity? To some people, that's super significant, and other people could really care less. And so again, the point, there's not a right answer here. It's just drawing out students' understanding of the word significant and what significant means, that it's a major impactful event, and understanding the nuances of meaning, that the significance of something isn't a static trait, and it's not the same for everyone. It can change depending on the person and depending on the situation. All right, so if you have additional time, if you didn't have additional time, you might stop there. So you have students read and say the word, you have them engage with your definition, you have them practice the definition with each other, you do the examples and non-examples, and you do some wordplay. With the more time, you also have opportunities for the students to embed the word in writing. And so I suggest that you provide scaffolded writing opportunities. Some students are going to be stronger writers. Some students are already going to know the words a little bit more than other students. And so the writing that they do should really reflect their current skill level. The easiest thing is to just substitute a target word for a synonym or a phrase. So for example, you might have a sentence with the word important in it, and the student's goal is to switch out the word important with the word significant, and that's it. You might have students complete closed sentences, selecting the most appropriate target word for a given context. So you might have a sentence, you have a couple of words to choose from that might fit in that sentence, and they choose the correct word. You might have students complete sentence stems by selecting a correct ending from multiple choice. A little bit harder than that is actually generating the ending to sentences. And the last piece, the hardest one, is generating whole sentences without any scaffolding. And this is what we tend to kind of jump to when we think of vocabulary instruction. Here's a word, here's a definition, write a sentence. But the problem with that approach is that if you're working with students who are just barely learning the word or who don't have a really deep knowledge of the word, the sentence that they're going to write is going to be really devoid of context. So for significance, the student might write, or significant, the student might write, the man was significant, or the event was significant. That's not really a helpful sentence at all for the student demonstrating what they know, or for you, the teacher, understanding whether they understand what significant means and how it's used in context. So you need to build up to writing whole sentences on their own. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of sentence writing: closed sentences and sentence starters. My closed sentences are using student-friendly context, but you could use academic context in these. My sentence starters are using academic context, but you could use student-friendly context in these. So it just really depends on your program and your instruction and your students and where they're at. Student-friendly contexts are often easier to engage with than academic context, so you might start with those first. So we learned the words indestructible and significant. And so in these closed sentences, the goal is for the student to choose the correct word that would go in the spot where those words appear. So he soon realized the computer was indestructible or significant. No matter how many times he dropped it, it never broke. So the student's goal would be to use the context of the sentence, to use their knowledge of what indestructible means and significant means to identify that the computer was indestructible. The next sentence, there needs to be a indestructible or significant amount of gas in the container before the balloon will rise. Now that I'm reading it, it sounds kind of sciencey to me, but it's a pretty student-friendly context. We can understand that concept. But again, so there needs to be a significant amount of gas, a major amount of gas in order for that balloon to rise. This also kind of draws out another facet of the meaning of significant. Before, we were talking about it as something really important, really impactful, and here is about the size of something that is really big. So it's got that same kind of nuance of gist of something that's really, really big, but it's slightly different. And so we're drawing out those nuances some more. Sentence starters for academic context. The most indestructible metal is blank because blank. So in this sentence starter, I'm assuming that you're probably in a science class and you just did a unit on metals, and that there's some metal that's more destructible than another one. And so you might embed sentence practice or writing practice for that word in this way. The most significant event in modern history is blank because blank. So again, just embedding the practice for writing about the word in some sort of context, academic context in this example. And these are both sentence starters. So again, these are designed to help students write sentences that really demonstrate their knowledge of the word. So we give them a little bit of context, and they need to fill out the rest of the context using their knowledge of the word, as opposed to just writing something from scratch, which often really doesn't work quite well at all. And the last and really important piece is discussing the meaning of the word in text. So it is really important, especially if you're drawing words from text to teach, to have students revisit the word as it's used in text and to apply their new knowledge about what that word means to the text that they're reading, and to discuss it with their peers and with you as a teacher. You ask the students what the word means within the context of that specific text. And then you always ask students to explain their thinking, to comment and expand on each other's thinking. And so this piece is really important. Many times when I am working with students from kindergarten through 12th grade, and a student says something that I believe initially is not quite right, or I don't understand, rather than giving them corrective feedback right away, especially with the older students, I'll say, tell me more about what you mean. Or I'll pick out something that I'm confused about and ask them about that. And what I find is most of the time, they have a really great rationale for why they said what they said, especially the older students. And it's just, I was thinking along different lines. And so I always ask them to explain their thinking. It helps them kind of work through what they were thinking and why. And then it also gives them an opportunity to show you what they really meant, rather than you initially thinking that they were just incorrect. So to wrap up, academic vocabulary words are interdisciplinary, high frequency, and high utility words. Adolescents need a lot of encounters with these words, up to 17 or more, before they really know the word deeply enough to remember it and use it in reading. Teaching these words directly and explicitly is really important for improving not just the quantity, but the quality of a student's understanding of a word. And when you provide this evidence-based instruction, you should include student-friendly definitions that you give to the student, instructional context or examples and non-examples, opportunities for wordplay, opportunities to use the word in writing, and opportunities to discuss the word within a text that you're reading. So here's our recommended resources. These are the robust vocabulary instruction resources that I mentioned. There's a lot of rich examples of what instruction might look like. And I believe this frequently asked questions and extended examples is geared toward middle and high school teachers. And then this research to practice of vocabulary instruction text as well as an excellent resource to use. So I recommend you take a moment if you haven't been jotting down notes already and go ahead and jot some notes or some questions on this part of your guided notes. And while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce the next practice, which is providing direct and explicit instruction on comprehension strategies. So just like the vocabulary strategy section or practice, this one also has strong evidence for improving reading outcomes for adolescents who have difficulty with reading. Comprehension strategies are routines and procedures. They're steps that students use or go through to help them make sense of text. We provide this comprehension strategy instruction, first of all, because many students who are having difficulty with reading in middle and secondary grades have difficulty with comprehension. It's a huge area of difficulty for these students. And by providing them with cognitive strategies for comprehending the text, we reduce the cognitive load on them associated with reading and understanding the text. So in students who are below grade level in reading, students with reading disabilities, when they're reading text, they're managing a lot of processes in their mind in order to get through the text. They're trying to decode the words, they're trying to read them fast enough to remember what the sentence said, they're trying to think about what words mean within the sentences, and then what the sentences mean across paragraphs. So it's a lot of work going on. And sometimes students who have reading difficulties have a lot of trouble managing all of those processes in their heads. And so we want to really make clear the steps that they go through to comprehend the text. We want to make it very clear so we reduce that cognitive load. We reduce how much they're keeping everything in their mind. And we also clarify what students need to do to understand the content. So often students who have difficulty with comprehension aren't really sure what they're supposed to be doing when they're reading text. So there's many different comprehension strategies, but I'm going to focus on two major and very important ones today, main idea and summarization. And I'll spend most of the time on main idea, and then I'll just give you a snapshot of what summarization might look like. And so when you're teaching these comprehension strategies, you have to think about the materials that you're using and the text that you're selecting to teach and practice the strategies on. First of all, the comprehension strategies, main idea and summarization are really appropriate for expository text and not really appropriate for narrative text. It's going to be quite difficult to derive a main idea from a paragraph of a story. Usually you'll like derive a theme or something like that across the paragraphs of a story. So main idea and summarization are really best suited for expository text. And also you have to think about the difficulty of the text that you're using to teach the strategy. And the suggestion is that when you're initially teaching the strategy, so here's the strategy, here's the steps, let's do some practice, you want to use text that is very accessible to the students. So it's text that is not difficult to decode, it's text that has relatively straightforward concepts or maybe familiar concepts to the student, so that all of their cognitive energy can be spent on using the strategy. as the students gain skill in applying the strategy to the text, you can increase the difficulty, and you should increase the difficulty level of the text, getting near grade level if possible. That way they learn how to use the strategy that you just taught them on actual text that they're reading in class. I also recommend always pairing graphic organizers with comprehension strategy instruction. Graphic organizers themselves are an evidence-based practice for supporting comprehension outcomes for students, and they are great ways to, again, reduce cognitive load, help students put their thoughts on paper, and help students retain and remember information. And also I recommend using cue cards. These are just little cards that list the steps of the strategy, again, so the students initially don't have to memorize them. You do want them to memorize the steps of the strategy eventually, but initially give them cue cards or have posters on the wall or digital cue cards that the students can use to help them remember the strategy. Timeline for instruction. You don't teach comprehension strategies in one day. It can take 5, 8 days, maybe even more, depending on your students and depending on the strategy. And the lessons are a bit longer. So 20-minute lessons, 45-minute lessons, there's a big range of what this might look like. But the big idea here is that instruction is going to take some time. It's going to take a week, maybe 2 weeks to initially learn a strategy, and then you're going to practice this strategy for the rest of the school year. You're not ever going to let it go. Eventually, the students are going to select and use the strategies that make sense to use for particular texts on their own. And there's a general instructional cycle that you want to go through when you're teaching comprehension strategies. So if you go through this instructional cycle, you maximize your students' learning and their ability to use the comprehension strategies eventually on their own. And so, of course, you want to first introduce the strategy. So you explain what the strategy is, you provide rationale for why the students want to use this strategy in text. You have the students read and analyze with your support examples of what the strategy might look like, and then also non-examples. So when you use main idea, this is what a main idea might look like for this text. This one's not a main idea, and let's talk about why. So you really help provide a context for what the strategy looks like in text. Then you're going to need to model how you apply the strategy to a text. So going through a think aloud, using your cue card, showing students exactly what you expect them to do. You provide a lot of guided practice where students work on applying the strategy maybe in pairs or in small groups to a text. Maybe they do it with you, the teacher, in a small group intervention kind of format. You provide independent practice where the students are practicing the strategy on their own with corrective feedback. So it's really important that corrective feedback and positive feedback is happening in here as well. And then throughout the year, you provide opportunities for students to review the strategy. So remember that main idea strategy that we learned. What was a main idea again? Let's look at the steps again. I want you to apply it to text throughout the year. And that's going to help the students maintain knowledge of this skill. So not forgetting it because you introduced it for 2 weeks and then never used it again. That's not the point. Once you introduce it, you want them to use it for the rest of their days of reading. And to generalize use of the strategy across different texts, across different levels of text, across different content areas, across different teachers, across different scenarios. So to become really flexible with how they use the strategy. And again, all of this instructional cycle is occurring first in easier text and then with more difficult text for your students. And whether it's easy or difficult depends on your students' reading levels and where they're reading. And so let's dive into main idea. So a main idea is a gist of what a paragraph is mostly about. Again, it's best to do main idea on expository or informational text, not narratives. And main idea generation is best for paragraphs and not entire text. So you don't want to have a student read like 5 paragraphs of text and then say, what was the main idea? Because it's likely there is 5 main ideas in there. Main idea is not the same as a summary. So you'll see what a summary is in a little bit. So again, we provide main idea strategy instruction because it supports students actively thinking around text. It gives something for the students to think about and to look for as they're reading text, which is going to help their comprehension. It reduces that cognitive load, remembering information, helps students pinpoint what's most important in the text and kind of ignore the irrelevant details. It helps the notes that students take, so they annotate text with main ideas, helps serve as reminders and references of what the text is about. So if they have to answer a comprehension question or if they need to go back and review something that they've read, they can read their main ideas rather than having to go back through and read the whole text, which can be quite difficult for some students. And also builds towards summarization skills. So knowing how to generate main ideas of text is really a prerequisite skill for comprehension or for summarization. Some basic requirements, main ideas need to have a subject or topic. So that's who or what the paragraph is about. And they need to have important actions. So that's what's most important about what the subject or what the topic did. They should be in students' own words, not just copied straight from the text, but as much as possible in students' own words. And some strategies ask that the main ideas are about 10 words or less, but in my practice, I found that with some expository text at the upper grades, that's really difficult to do even for me. And so you might consider allowing maybe 1, maybe 2 sentences for an expository text that's really dense conceptually, or that has very long paragraphs with multiple main ideas. So here's some strategies. I'll just pause a moment so that you can look over these strategies for main idea. So you'll notice that these are basically steps for what the students need to do as they're reading in order to figure out what's most important about the passage. The strategies can be more steps like this one, the main idea strategy, or they can be fewer steps like the wrap strategy. But the strategy isn't just the cue card, isn't just the steps. There's a lot of instruction that teachers do going through that instructional cycle that I explained. So explaining the rationale for the strategy, what it looks like, examples, non-examples, lots of modeling, guided practice, independent practice. The main idea strategy that I'm going to highlight is one that we used with 8th graders several years ago to derive main ideas from a history textbook. And so the steps, this instruction came with a cue card. So you'll see the cue card right over here on the right-hand side. And it was essentially a T-chart where on the left-hand side of the T-chart, the student would write who or what is most important about the paragraph. I'm sorry, on the left-hand side. I think I said left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, the student would write what is most important about the subject. And then along the bottom, they would combine the who or what and the action into a main idea. And then these suggestions for what an action actually is came from Asha Jitendra's work. And they suggest that the action in the paragraph must describe why something happened, where something happened, when it happened, how it happened, or how someone felt. And then it just reminds the students that some paragraphs have a couple of sentences or details that really aren't anything to do with the main idea. And so the steps that students use are here. So they read the paragraph, find the subject, find each action, combine the subject and the action into a sentence, and then check that their main idea makes sense. And so we're going to look at each of these steps a little bit more closely. When we ask the students to read a paragraph, we do prompt them to check to see if there's already a topic sentence or a main idea sentence. Before middle school, students learn that the first sentence of a paragraph is the main idea. And that's true for a lot of texts at the lower elementary level. But at the middle school and high school level, that's really not true most of the time. But you can still prompt students to check and see if that first sentence makes sense as the main idea. And if it doesn't, or if they're not sure, then they're going to move on to step 2, which is to find the subject of the paragraph, who or what the paragraph is about, and write it on the T-chart. If students are having trouble with that, then we just have them list all the subjects in the paragraph, all the who's or what's, and then move on to step 3. So then they reread each sentence, write what's most important about the who or what, and then of course, if they're having difficulty, then they can just write all of the actions that happened, and then they're going to go through and they're going to eliminate the ones that occur less frequently or that seem less important at the end. And then they're going to combine the who or what and who or what the paragraph is about and what's important together to make their main idea sentence. And they might need to combine some ideas or reduce the number of ideas they have if they're finding that they're needing to write multiple sentences. So we want to get them down to 1, maybe 2 sentences. And so this is a paragraph on which we had 8th graders write main ideas. And right here are responses of 8th graders before they received main idea instruction. So the paragraph is numbered, each sentence is numbered 1 through 5. The British government wanted the colonists to pay the cost of keeping the British Army in the colonies. To raise money, the British government passed the Townsend Acts. These acts placed a duty on glass, paint, and tea each time the colonists bought these things. To many colonists, the Townsend duties were simply taxes in disguise. So the students would read that paragraph themselves, and this is their responses for the question, what is the main idea of this paragraph before instruction? So one student said, British government wanted the colonists, and that was the entire response. The good thing is that it has the subject, the British government, but it's missing the actions. What about, they wanted the colonists what? And if I'm looking back at the paragraph, I realized they just started copying that first sentence. The second response, the most important in this passage, is mostly about the money and the colonies. So this response doesn't have the subject or the action in it, but it does kind of get a gist that this paragraph has something to do with money, has something to do with the colonies, but there's really not a whole lot of depth to this response. The student really doesn't know what's going on in this paragraph. And the last response, he didn't want to do his thing. This is a legit response that we got from a student who was missing the subject and the action, and really just indicates either a lack of engagement or a complete misunderstanding or not knowing what this passage is about at all. And so for these students, we would recommend this kind of instruction. So let's try it. Let's walk through what the strategy might look like. So our first step is to read the paragraph. We've done that. Check. Check to see if there's already a topic sentence. You could say actually in this paragraph that this first sentence is the topic sentence. Though it's missing some information about towns and acts in this, I think we can make it a little bit better, main idea than this first sentence. But the first sentence is actually pretty close in this paragraph. So we'll move on to step 2, find the subject, who or what the paragraph is about. So in the first 2 sentences, the British government is the subject here. The British government are the people who are acting on something. They wanted the colonists to pay, and they passed the Towns and Acts. But there's other subjects in this paragraph as well. And initially, students get really confused as to which one's the most important subject, what's a subject and what's an object in the paragraph. And so we'll just highlight them all, because the paragraph is also about acts, the Towns and Acts, and it's also talking about colonists. So we'll highlight them all for now and eliminate later, and we'll put them on the left-hand side of our T-chart. Our next step is to reread each sentence and write what is most important about the subject in our T-chart. So for the first sentences, we know that the British government, they wanted the colonists to pay for keeping the British Army in the colonies, and that they passed the Towns and Acts. So we're going to combine that information into a little phrase here. And notice these are just really short notes on our notes guide. The students aren't writing full sentences here. So they passed the Towns and Acts, so the colonists paid for the cost of the army. What do we know about the Towns and Acts? Well, we know that they are a duty or a tax on glass, paint, and tea, which we can just combine and say categorize as goods. So the Towns and Acts place a duty on goods. And then what do we know about the colonists? We know that they felt that the acts were taxes in disguise. So we basically have our whole paragraph charted here on this cue card, and it's too much for a main idea. So we need to do some elimination. So we might remember what important actions are over here. And we know that something is important to include if it talks about why something happened, where something happened, when something happened, how something happened, or how someone felt. And in this paragraph, we have 2 pieces of those present. So we have why something happened, so why the Towns and Acts were passed, and we have how the colonists felt about those acts. They felt they were taxes in disguise. And so we'll just drop away that detail about what the Towns and Acts are. That's not really part of the main idea of the paragraph. It's an important detail, but it's not the main idea. So our next step would be to combine the who or what and the actions into a main idea statement, but it's very difficult to combine these 2 subjects and these 2 details into 1 or 2 sentences about the main idea. And so we need to do some more work and some more thinking about what this paragraph is mostly about. And so that's what we're thinking. So what is it mostly about? Is it mostly about the British government passing the Towns and Acts, or is it mostly about how the colonists feel? And when I read the paragraph, I realized that most of the sentences are really about the British government and the Towns and Acts, and how the colonists felt is really in that last sentence. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that one away. And what we're left with is the British government and why they passed the Towns and Acts. So we'll combine those in together to make a main idea statement in our own words, which is here. The British government passed the Towns and Acts as a way to make the colonists pay for the British Army. So this main idea is a little bit more detailed than the topic sentence here in this paragraph, but it's very similar to that one. It ended up being very similar. There's not going to be one answer for what the main idea is of a paragraph. There's a couple of different ways that you can phrase this. It just depends on what you're identifying as really what's most important in the paragraph. It depends on how long the paragraphs are. Some paragraphs are really difficult to write a main idea on at all. So that's why it's really important that when you're starting this instruction, you start it with texts that are relatively straightforward so that your students gain skill and confidence in using the skill. And then as they feel really confident and successful in using the skill, you can introduce harder and harder texts, and you can introduce texts that really don't have a clear main idea and explain to students. A lot of the times, finding main ideas is really going to be helpful. Sometimes when you try and find a a main idea in a passage or in a paragraph, you might have a hard time. Maybe there's just two main ideas, or maybe there's a lot of stuff going on, and that's okay. What's important is that you're thinking about who or what is this paragraph about and what happened. So to wrap up, a main idea is really just the gist of what a paragraph is about. It contains the most important subjects, actions, and it's short and concise. The strategies for main idea provide the steps for how you do it. We want to include graphic organizers to support students in remembering what they're doing. So remembering all the subjects, remembering all the actions, and combining the information. Main idea instruction is best for expository or informational text. It's best on paragraphs, not on multiple paragraphs. It's going to be difficult to find a main idea across several paragraphs. That's really what a summary is for. And so main ideas are not summaries. Summaries, on the other hand, tell the main points of a passage, like an entire passage or a large section of text. And so we provide summarization instruction for the same reasons we provide main idea instruction. We support active thinking around the text, reduce cognitive load, help students remember what's most important, have them write notes that are really helpful references to look back on, especially when they're studying. And then also in general, writing extended in an extended way about text really helps support content learning and content knowledge. So writing summaries of what students read is a great way to support content knowledge as well. So here's one summarization strategy that I think is really very straightforward, and it builds very nicely from the main idea strategy. This is in a Denton et al. Textbook. And the steps are for students to first list the main ideas for each paragraph. So already you can see being able to generate main ideas is a prerequisite skill for doing a summary. If you want to write a good summary, you need to know how to write a good main idea. Then underline the main idea statements that include the most important ideas. So just like a paragraph might have sentences that are not part of the main idea, a passage might have main ideas that aren't really going to be a good part of a summary. So you're looking across the main ideas to see what's most important to include in my summary. You're going to combine any ideas that go together into one sentence. You're going to number the ideas in a logical order, write your summary paragraph, and then edit your paragraph. So the editing piece is really important and something also that you need to directly teach explicitly. And so I'm not going to step through all the steps of what this might look like, but you'll see over here on the right-hand side is a multi-paragraph passage. This is written at 1270 Lexile about the high school level. And on the left-hand side, the student has already written main ideas for each of the paragraphs. And we'll notice that they underlined all those main ideas. There's only 4 of them because they felt like they're all important. And that the main ideas already were actually quite short, and so they didn't really need to combine any of them together. It's not that they didn't need to combine them because they were short. They didn't need to combine them because each main idea really was a slightly different concept, and so it didn't make sense to combine them. They numbered the ideas in a logical order, and then the next step is to write the summary paragraph. So if we were to combine these main ideas into a summary, we're going to need to do a little bit of revision and rewriting, but we might get something like this. Mariachi means an exciting musical ensemble. Mariachi music began in the Mexican state of Jalisco. The main music played by mariachi was the son. There are famous sones from many regions in Mexico. So that's a concise summary that really tells about what the whole passage is about using this main idea, or I'm sorry, the summarization strategy. So that was just a really quick review of what the strategy is, but just like a main idea, you'd have to introduce the strategy, explain the strategy. So examples of a good summary and a poor summary for passages, model actually writing the summary for students in a much more in-depth way than I just did, provide lots of guided practice, independent practice, and then practice over time and across different kinds of text. So to wrap up comprehension, there's a really strong evidence base for using comprehension strategies to support reading for adolescents. Strategies are those procedures and processes that readers go through to understand text. Main idea and summarization really are helpful strategies for supporting students' understanding and retention of information in text. We use graphic organizers and cue cards to support students during their learning, and we want to follow that consistent instructional cycle where we introduce and provide rationale for the strategy, model, provide guided practice, independent practice, and opportunities for generalization and maintenance. So go ahead and take a moment, if you haven't already, to fill out the comprehension strategies column of your guided notes. And we'll move on to providing intensive intervention, which is the last strategy that I'll share that's evidence-based with strong evidence for improving outcomes for adolescent readers. So intensive intervention is supplemental assessment-driven intensive instruction designed to meet the needs of the specific needs of a student. And so this is really intentional instruction that is really tailored to suit the strengths and areas of need of particular students. Typically, intensive interventions come after some formal assessment, and I don't mean formal assessment process for like identifying disability. I mean a more formal assessment than just observation or just like informal inventories to see exactly what the student's area of strength and need are. You design intervention or you identify an intervention that is going to address the student's specific needs. And that intervention is intensive. So you spend a lot of time on instruction, maybe 5 days a week for 30 minutes. You have small group sizes. Maybe it's a group of 2 or 3 students with the same needs, or maybe it's one-on-one with you, the teacher, during groups in your classroom or during supplemental instruction. And the rationale is that some students in the middle and high school ages need explicit and really intensive instruction, sometimes on very foundational skills that they haven't been taught in the classroom for years and years, like decoding. You can provide intensive instruction for comprehension as well and for vocabulary. You can provide it for any area of reading. But sometimes some students really, the whole class instruction isn't going to cut it. They need real purposeful intensive instruction tailored directly to what they need. And so our focus today is going to be on word level interventions. So the reason for that is because at the middle and high school level, when students have difficulty in reading, a lot of time they have difficulty understanding what's read. But at the root of that difficulty, part of the problem often is decoding. So most students, estimates are between 80 and 85% with real significant reading difficulties, have a difficulty with decoding, with getting the words off the page, sounding them out, figuring out those patterns. That's what decoding is. It's the process of applying letter sound knowledge relationships and letter patterns, so chunking words, to read them. Early intervention is so essential to supporting students' reading needs. It's so critical that we catch students in first grade, maybe second grade is already kind of starting to get late to catch students to prevent some reading difficulties. But we know that we get students in middle and high school who have persistent difficulties, who fell through the cracks, or who just need some extra instruction. And so even though early intervention is essential in reading and decoding, adolescents do improve when we provide this kind of instruction. And so it's definitely worth it. If you have adolescents in your class who you notice when you give them a text to read, they're having a lot of difficulty reading the words on that page, providing them with instruction on how to read those words is going to be beneficial. And these strategies can be incorporated by any teacher who's trained to use a strategy, as well as what more often occurs in intensive interventions, like a special educator or a reading specialist might do this instruction, but all teachers can do this instruction as well. And so I've selected two strategies really that I've used with students across the spectrum of age, actually fourth grade all the way through high school, to support their word reading. And it's the best strategy paired with every syllable has at least one vowel strategy or concept. And so the best strategy prompts students to break words apart, examine the parts, say each part, and then try the whole word. So they're going to try their best. When they examine the parts, they go through a series of steps to figure out how they're going to break the word further apart. So they identify known patterns or morphemes, they underline vowels of what's left, and then they break what's left into parts so that each part has one vowel sound. So it could be a single vowel on its own, or it could be a vowel team, or a consonant vowel E pattern, like a magic E pattern. And so I'm just going to demonstrate what this looks like on this word up here. So our first step is to break the word apart. So you prompt students to look at the word, and a lot of times what happens is students will look at this word and become overwhelmed by how long it is. So student might look at the first part and guess the rest, or just completely skip it. But you have them break off the pieces that they recognize. So if they're adolescents, they might already recognize re at the beginning and meant at the end, which is great. And remember, we're not providing like vocabulary instruction here. We're just trying to get them to read the patterns. So maybe they recognize re and they recognize meant. Our next step is to examine the parts. And so we've already identified our known patterns or morphemes. So we have re at the beginning and we have meant at the end, but we've got this thing in the middle and I'm not quite sure how to read this part. And so what we're going to do is we're going to underline the vowels that are in that part. And then we're going to use those vowels to break that part, that little piece of a word apart. And so we'll break off those two pieces so that each part has one vowel or one vowel sound. So we'll do our double check and I see that each part just has one vowel or one vowel sound. Our next step is to say each part. So now we have this word broken apart. We can just read the parts. So we have re, plen, ish, ment. So you have the students read it a couple of times. Replenish-ment, replenish-ment. And our last step is to just try the word all together. Now that we've broken it apart, now that we've said the parts a couple of times, let's read it all together. Replenishment. And so I physically broke this word apart on the screen. You can have students draw lines to break words apart. They can use their fingers. I mean, eventually they will do this work in their head, just like we do as adults when we encounter a word that we've never seen before. We quickly decode it using our knowledge of letter patterns to read the word. And so we get students to engage in that activity over and over until it's natural to them. So to wrap up, these word level interventions are really appropriate for the adolescents who need them. They're not appropriate for students who don't need them. But if your kids are having difficulty reading words, multisyllabic words, then these interventions are appropriate for them. This intensive instruction is critical for supporting their individualized needs. Word reading strategies help students identify and read the patterns in the words. So we're focused on the reading part, not on the meaning part. That's what the vocabulary instruction is for, though you can often integrate vocabulary and word reading instruction, and they do help each other out. Intensive intervention in word reading is going to involve a lot of time and resources, but you can actually teach them in as few as 5 to 10 minutes of practice per day, every day. So if before you read that text, if you review your 3 vocabulary words, you might also practice decoding an additional 3 to 5 words that, you know, students, when they look at that word, they're going to skip it or they might not know how to read it. And so you might not worry about the meaning of those words, but you might help students practice actually getting the word off the page and decoding it using the BEST strategy. So I recommend, if you haven't already, to go ahead and fill out that guided section, part of your notes for word reading strategies, or that's the intensive intervention piece. And to summarize, today we reviewed 3 evidence-based practices, all with strong evidence for supporting the needs of the adolescents who have difficulty with reading. And that was providing explicit vocabulary instruction. We focused on academic vocabulary, supporting and providing reading strategy instruction to support reading comprehension. And so we focused on main idea and summarization. And then providing intensive intervention. And we focused on word reading intervention since that's still a great need of many adolescents who have difficulty with reading. There's some web resources. If you're not familiar with them already, go ahead and check out the IRA Center, the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And then again, I just have linked Cox Head's academic word list. And these are references that I cited in the presentation. So thank you so much for your time. I hope this information was helpful and that even if you knew some of this information, you learned something new today. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristen. This will conclude today's webinar. For more resources, be sure to visit the Transition Alliance of South Carolina's webpage at transitionalliancesc.org. Thank you and have a great day.